Do you think that the U.S. has an obligation to intervene militarily in every single conflict or humanitarian crisis in any country around the world at any given time?
No, I don't believe so, because it's also not practical.
Mr. Dylan Burns, how you doing, Dylan?
Hello, I'm doing pretty good. How are you guys doing today?
Doing good, man. Thanks for coming on and chatting with us.
Happy to be on here. You guys have a lot of amazing guests here. Even though I probably don't agree with you guys on everything, I'm always surprised by the productivity usually of the show you host here, even with people you disagree with, which is one of the reasons I wanted to come on.
Well, thanks so much, man. That really means a lot. And I can't say we've always kept it 100% classy or productive, but we try our best to make this a space for, real productive exchanges. And especially when we're talking about such a serious issue, like obviously what's going on in Ukraine and Russia with the conflict is so tragic. It's an absolute humanitarian atrocity. And I mean, I think that, before we get into our disagreements, we can obviously agree about that. It's horrible. It's tragic. We both want it to end as soon as possible. This isn't some sort of debate me, bro, fucking performance art that we're doing for sport. Like, no, we actually want to have this conversation because we really care about the substance here. We really care about the lives that are at stake here in this devastating conflict and, hopefully resolve it as quickly as possible. Really excited to have the conversation. Hopefully it's productive. Hopefully, we can find some common ground, but either way, welcome to the stream. Glad you're willing to engage with us. Glad you were wanting to engage with us. In fact, you reached out to us, I'm guessing after you saw our video with Kyle Kalinske on the subject matter.
No, I did not see your video with Kyle Kalinske on the subject matter. It's just a lot of my people kept telling me to come on the show because they were people like, hey, I like the Vanguard, but I disagree with their Ukraine takes. I think I want you to talk to them about Ukraine takes. Or I want you to talk to them because I just want to see somebody who's been on the ground talk to them, stuff like that. I've gotten messages from my community asking me to come on.
Gotcha. Well, before we do get into all that, can you just introduce yourself to our community in case there's anyone that's not familiar with you and the work you've done, including the literal on the ground reporting in Ukraine? If you just want to, discuss that a little bit, talk about the work that you've been doing.
Sure. So my name's Dylan Burns. Before Twitch streaming, I was involved in a lot of local politics in the state of Maryland. I ran my mayoral campaign. I was involved in the Mike Gravel campaign, which even if I think like a lot of my politics have changed since I worked on the Mike Gravel campaign, I still think the work I did there was really good. And a lot of really good activists came from that campaign and learned a lot of skills from working with other people their age or developing a presidential campaign. I've advised a few congressional campaigns on the issue of foreign policy, but what most people know me for is my online stuff. Like I hosted the Hippy Dippy Roundtable, which was the #1 Twitch political debate show for almost like 2 years before I closed it down because I went to Ukraine. But most recently, what I've been focusing on is war journalism, interviewing civilians on the ground about their experiences in Ukraine, interviewing soldiers about the type of help they think they need, and what's it like to fight in combat. Like we interviewed some soldiers who were involved in the Kharkiv counteroffensive. We haven't released that footage yet, but my most recent piece that I released was me going to the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant that's been in the news recently and speaking to the locals around there about the fear of a nuclear disaster occurring and the type of shelling they face just being a few miles from the Russian army and having shells blow up by their home. A lot of stuff didn't get included in that piece. One of the stories that I thought was the most gripping for me personally in that piece that I always like to mention is that while we did end up drinking with them near the power plant to get a good interview, because I believe very fundamentally and you need to hang out with the locals. You don't need to just say hello, here's my list of questions, because that's how you get the best interview. It's a little gonzo, but I believe in it a lot. One of the things I was able to receive from them, and a lot of people deal with trauma in different ways in war, but the shelling is so heavy around that area that he said that he has to get just blackout wasted to sleep some nights, like with vodka. It's the only way, because the audio of the shelling is so heavy. And that night, I heard 50 explosions in 30 seconds near that power plant, which when you're dealing with that heavy shelling where every second there's an explosion during some periods in the night, it's easy to understand exactly why they need that type of substances to like cope with the reality of war around there. And there's a million stories that I'm trying to communicate by doing this type of gonzo journalism. That's what I'm focusing on now with my work.
Yeah, that's really interesting. If you mind me asking, how did you kind of find yourself to be, on the ground in Ukraine? How did you find yourself to be, taken back by this issue? Obviously the Russian, offensive invasion of Ukraine was, I think almost 300 days ago. I don't have the dates exactly. It was
252.
252 days ago, yeah. And was at that time, were you already following the happenings in Ukraine? Was that something that was already part of your political awareness?
I was aware of what was going on in Ukraine, but it wasn't like a main focus of my work. Like, I knew people in Ukraine, and I knew about the war, and I did some studying around it, but it wasn't my main focus. My main focus was actually mostly the Middle East, particularly Syria, and the policies of the Assad regime, and particularly the Kurdish independence struggle, which is something that I very fundamentally believe in. But once the war happened, I started to cover it, and my views just skyrocketed. It was insane. It was like out of nowhere, nobody wanted to talk about foreign policy, and then the next day, everybody was a foreign policy expert, and everybody wanted to watch. I don't know if you remember this, but remember when like the first few days of the invasion, every Twitch streamer, every streamer wasn't like reacting to content or videos. They were just watching the Kiev live camera, which was broadcasting 24 hours what it was like in Kiev, just waiting for an explosion, just waiting for something to happen, like Russian troops to just storm into the capital so they could see history live. And me, like everybody else, I covered that. And I felt weird because I was making a lot of money, but like, I'm 21, right? I'm a young guy. When I make like $10,000 in a month, like, that's a lot of money to me, right? That's a lot of money. And that's the type of money I was making at that time. But I felt weird because I was making all this money as tanks were exploding and people were dying, and I was just reacting to that. I'd be like, man, that's a crazy explosion. Thanks for the $20, Black Ebony. I appreciate that. Thank you, 42069 weed lover, smoker, poggers 92. Yeah, now let's get back to this torture video, right? It's like, it felt a little immoral. It felt, you know what it felt like? I felt like I was like the director of almost like a snuff film, which it felt weird to me. And so I decided that people had trusted me with a lot of money, so I took my savings along with the money that I'd made, and I spent about $20,000 to $30,000 to go to Ukraine, get a camera crew, a small one, not a big one because I couldn't afford it. Learn the ropes and help with aid in any way I could, which included like the delivery of Starlink and stuff like that I was involved in. And I believe more in the work that I'm doing now than anything I was doing beforehand. I felt very, I feel very passionately about this. And so now that I even have more friends there, people that, I had to put my lives in the hands of, and they had to trust me to, possibly have to apply a tourniquet if something was to go wrong. You get very close to people. Now that closeness is, I hope it's communicated in the work I do when it comes to filming and interviews.
Yeah, I mean, it's clearly communicated in the way that you're discussing this right now. I can only imagine any type of wartime when you're in a situation of just dire stress and trauma in every direction, and you're only meeting people that have been the victims of just intense trauma, and not only that, shell shock, any kind of horror that you would only be exposed to in war. Yeah, I mean, and that's one of the things that I think Gavin and I both really want to stress when we have our, policy disagreements on this. And obviously, emotions will fly. This is an internet show. But I think that Gavin and I really have like an issue with the coldness that's been put at the forefront of a lot of the skepticism of U.S. aid to Ukraine, particularly because, I mean, I'm sure you're aware, Gavin and I have just a skepticism of any U.S. involvement in providing aid in any situation. But I do think that oftentimes when that skepticism is relayed, people do so with the intent of getting the adulation and the applause of the Putin is based in owning the libs kind of clicks. And I want to make it just
very marketable online when you get to be when you're the contrarian man, dude. It's the easiest position in the world from an optics point of view.
Just look at Haxon and all those guys that take their shirts off and absolutely. But Gavin and I just want to set the table with making it clear that's not our position at all. I think that, the Russian invasion is entirely indefensible. And I just know how close you are to the people that are impacted by this, which is why I wanted to make sure that we'd start this conversation off by saying that is absolutely not our position.
Yeah. I mean, I've seen a lot of this aid delivered, and it makes a very, very measurable impact. I remember seeing American field rations with, it says it has the symbol of the United States on it, being eaten by soldiers, and thinking I'm thinking about the state of a lot of old military rations, definitely in this part of the world, and the type of food they would be eating otherwise. And I'm like, wow, this is having a measurable impact.
Yeah.
It was most aggressive for me, like when I was around Kharkiv, seeing like body armor that we had funded be used by aid workers to deliver more aid, when a lot of aid workers are getting torn to shreds during aid deliveries because they have to deliver it to people who live in basically like a no man's land. And the people who live in no man's land the most are also the most vulnerable, because it's usually the elderly, it's usually people with nowhere else to go, it's usually people who, a lot of disabled people, unironically, because they just, like, who's gonna go get them if they don't have any family member to come get them, and like they have all their belongings there. And usually disabled people in this part of the world are very poor. They're usually part of a lower class generally because of like how like economics works, sadly. But just the desperation that is relieved by a lot of this aid is having a real impact. And so I think when we talk about this aid, I think a lot of people just see dollar signs, when I think a lot of times we should be talking about the human lives that is also impacted.
Yeah, well, just to also clarify, in no way am I against the U.S. sending like food or rations or any sort of like non-lethal aid. Like, I don't think that's any issue at all. I don't think that's escalatory with Russia. I don't think that that's in any way ethically questionable, right? In the same way that when there's a earthquake in Haiti, you know, we send rations and we send aid and we try to help people on the ground there and make sure that, you know, they're doing okay. Like, I don't think there's anything wrong with that. If a humanitarian crisis is happening, then we should be sending that sort of aid. Absolutely. The issue that I have more so is with the military aid itself and the quote unquote lethal aid. And I guess just to kind of get a foundation for this conversation, so we understand each other's position. Do you consider yourself, because I consider myself an anti-interventionist when it comes to America's role on the world stage. What would you consider yourself an interventionist?
I mean, it depends what you mean by interventionist. I believe America should be involved in the world stage, but I also don't believe the solution to every problem is dropping bombs, right? When I say involved in the world stage, when we talk about something like Western Sahara, I don't think that means we need to be like invading Morocco to liberate the people of Western Sahara, right? But I do think that us like throwing Western Sahara under the bus for Israeli diplomacy is the wrong way for America to be involved. But the solution isn't isolate. The solution is change course, right? Because I would hate it to be if the end of human development was just, okay, fuck everybody else, just care about your neighbor. Just care about your neighbor and yourself. And so I believe that we should be involved in the world stage in some capacity. But when I say that, I think a lot of people think, oh, that means you think bombs are the solution to every issue. Of course not. I think they should be the last option, not the first option. This was merely forced by the Russians invading Ukraine, right? We wouldn't even be talking about this like amount of lethal aid we're talking about now if it wasn't for that invasion. When it comes to Yemen, I believe we should completely drop support for the Saudi government in the war in Yemen. I believe that we should stop sending aid to Israel until they stop West Bank expansion at the very least. That's like the bare minimum when it comes to aid to Israel. I believe that the United States was wrong to invade Iraq. Like, I think a lot of people perceive me in a certain way because I'm focusing on a war where I think we should be involved in right now, and so they kind of like put me in a box. But generally, when it comes to American military intervention around the world, I've been against the majority of U.S. actions. Not all of them, right? But the majority of them.
So you can agree that our track record is spotty, to say the least.
Of course. I think most countries have a spotty track record, especially if you give any country the amount of power the United States has.
Sure, that's fair. That's fair to say. But definitely the U.S. has not had a very good track record when it comes to humanitarianism. I think it's fair to say that most of our interventions, while they might be done under the guise of humanitarianism, Ukraine included, that's not really what we care about. And again, I think the track record speaks to that. So you might think that this specific instance is like, oh, well, this happens to align with the correct position. But what I'm worried about is that given the spotty track record that we both just acknowledged, that these kind of interventions, including the one in Ukraine, right, legitimizes our status as the world police. And you wouldn't want us to be the world police, right?
I think when we talk about like whether or not we're involved in Ukraine for humanitarian reasons, I think a lot of times when it comes to like foreign policy and the reason any nation's involved in a conflict, we like simple answers, right? For example, when you take Middle East, everybody just likes to say oil, and then like the conversation's done. You don't need to talk about like power balancing or anything else that could be like, or a relationship with Israel. Like, you don't need to talk about anything else, right? If you just say oil or like this one like solid answer, then it's like an easy explanation for like, I think me. When I think there's multiple factors, I do think that we're involved in Ukraine partially, most certainly for strategic reasons. I also think that the amount of aid that we're giving Ukraine is also due to the amount of support Ukraine has from the American people. It's a very easily sympathetic fight and sympathetic position the Ukrainians are in, and you can see that the vast majority of Americans support sending aid to Ukraine, even if, and the pollsters have asked this question as well, even if there is a detrimental economic impact to their daily lives, which is a wild thing to say when it comes to a humanitarian struggle around the world. Because if you ask any person in America, should we end world hunger? Yes. Well, should we fund it? Well, probably not. So this is actually a really amazing moment we've captured when it comes to like the American like public consciousness, especially this is right after we withdrew from Afghanistan. So really, it was like it was a tough crowd Zelensky was singing to, and he performed well. I would actually push back on that, just to throw in the question of how much do you think that the fact that mainstream media, CNN, MSNBC, TYT, a lot of the channels that people could get their media ran basically anti-Russia content for about 4.5 years, priming their audiences to be ready for when Russia did something extremely villainous. Do you think that played any role in the massive outpouring of public support, especially when you look at liberal channels, people who couldn't give two craps about what's happening in Yemen or Syria or Palestine, but because Putin is the enemy, the same guy that they view as responsible for putting Donald Trump in power, do you think that adds to the sympathetic crowd that Zelensky was singing to, as you put it? I do think Russia's track record and it being covered in the media certainly impacts like the lack of sympathy Americans have for the Russian position. Like if you look at like, if you ask the American, like, what do you think about the government, which has been showed with the Internet Research Agency to try to like have a detrimental impact on U.S. elections, or a nation that is very clearly also wants instability in the United States. And as an American, I don't want to shoot my neighbor, and my neighbor doesn't want to shoot me. We don't want instability. None of us really like it when like a bunch of like buildings start burning down in a riot. Nobody likes that. Nobody likes that lack of unity. And so when you paint it in that picture, and we know that the Russians have done this, even if sometimes it's been overblown by certain people who want to forget the fact that Hillary was a failed candidate. They want to forget the fact that Hillary didn't campaign in states like Michigan. She took them for granted and ran a bad strategy. But it's not true to say that Russia didn't do anything up to this point to already put themselves in a bad light in the American perspective when it comes to like trying to bring about instability. I mean, the fact that they've funded like both BLM and anti-BLM accounts is like, I think both particularly like obvious that they were trying to do something there. So I do think that it might be overblown because people want to make up for the fact that Hillary lost, she was a bad candidate. But I think Russia also, like, they engage in behavior that would make any American probably upset. But you would also not argue that America doesn't routinely do this in just about every other country where we want to meaningfully influence their election as well. Oh, we've done this historically as well. And I think those countries have every right to be angry at us. But, I mean, is it hypocritical? Yeah. But are we wrong to be angry? No. Interesting. Well, I wanted to continue to explore the concept of interventionism and kind of like where you stand on that, just to, again, understand where you're coming at from a foundational principled perspective, because again, you can go situation by situation, conflict by conflict. And I think it's easy to, understand or get emotionally attached and say, well, these people need this, so we need to send this. But I do think it's important to look at this from like a principled perspective of whether or not U.S. intervention is a good thing and whether or not us being the world police is a good thing. So I just wanted to ask you the question, do you think that the U.S. has an obligation to intervene militarily in every single conflict or humanitarian crisis in any country around the world at any given time? No, I don't believe so, because that's also not practical. I mean, that's like, even if we're talking about any type of policing, it's not practical to intervene in every single time a crime ever is being done at any point, because sometimes it doesn't end well. A great example would be Waco, right? Like, is the solution just going guns blazing and then get everyone killed? Probably not. There's a bunch of examples where we have bombed, for example, like black activists historically, through like military helicopters. Was that the solution there? Obviously not. Does that mean we let every like gang shooting that we could stop or crime that we could stop pass by? No. I do think there are times where the international community, the United States as well, I don't think the United States should really act as the sole actor, should get involved like when a humanitarian crisis is happening. Most of the time that shouldn't be military. That should only be like the last resort. I think most of the time it should be humanitarian assistance or assisting with the government in place and trying to deal with, like, for example, an outbreak of some disease. Haiti's a great example. I don't think that we should be sending American troops to the shores of Haiti, overthrow the government and install some fucking dictator. But if there is if they do ask for like humanitarian help in some capacity, I wouldn't be against like sending some aid in that capacity, or working with actors on the ground to see if they needed help with gangs in some other way.
Well, and then a follow-up question I would have to that is that, so you think it's smart or justifiable to intervene where it makes sense? So not every time, but where it makes sense.
Yeah, I'll give you an example of something that's going on right now where I think that you could create a scenario where I would be fine with intervention. It would be Myanmar. The Tatmadaw has actively engaged in a genocide against the Rohingya Muslims. Over 750,000 people forced from their homes, raped, burning down of villages. Then they overthrow the democratically elected government of Aung San Suu Kyi, even though they were power sharing, even though it was already a flawed democracy because the military by default got 25% of the seats in their parliament. Even though they by default got ministerial positions, they overthrew the government, arrested protesters, started killing more people. I think that is an example of, that is something where even where the protesters and the revolutionaries are asking for sanctions on military companies. And it was 100% good for Biden to apply those military sanctions because that's what the revolutionaries, that's what the people on the ground wanted. They don't want their military to be funded so they can go just mow down more protesters. Even if it's not that strategically useful for the United States, I still think we should apply those sanctions and help protesters in any way we can.
Right. Well, my follow-up question would be, do you think that other global superpowers, for example, China or even Russia, do you think they similarly have an obligation to intervene militarily in every conflict or humanitarian crisis that we as America sponsor or that we as America facilitate? Some of the ones you mentioned, including Yemen, Palestine, etc. We just wrapped up.
If it's a righteous cause, yes. For example, I'm not really going to blame many people for funding the Viet Cong. The Viet Cong engaged in disgusting behavior during the war. Obviously, my grandfather who raised me was a American soldier in Vietnam, and the type of stuff he's seen were horrific. But at the end of the day, we were trying to uphold the government that descended from like French colonialist power and didn't have much support. And it was a dictatorship. To be completely honest, it wasn't really a democracy. Same problem in Korea. Thankfully, in Korea and Taiwan, democracy eventually came to both the Korean Peninsula across the DMZ and to Taiwan. But in Vietnam, like, we were just propping up like a dictatorial government that collapsed the same way the ANA collapsed because it could not sustain itself without American backing because it wasn't popular. Not because it was too weak, but just because it wasn't that popular. So I do think there are some scenarios. I just don't think Ukraine is one of those examples, or I don't think that the Chinese invasion of Vietnam after we left was one of those examples, when they were angry because Vietnam was like Pol Pot sucks, which Pol Pot did suck. So I do think there are, like, you could find a scenario where 100% it would have been a correct.
Well, let's talk about like recent American
for example,
history.
the Algerian Revolution is an example of that.
Sure. Well, let's talk about some recent American history. You know, you acknowledge the spotty track record, to say the least, of our interventions, and Russia's not the only country, not the only superpower in the 21st century to conduct an illegal and offensive invasion of another country. We did that in Afghanistan and Iraq, and I personally don't think it actually would have been a good idea for, say, Russia or China to intervene and try to stop us from doing that. Again, as horrible as it was, everyone that watches the Vanguard knows that I'm, a critic first and foremost of U.S. foreign policy, and think it was just.
You don't think the Chinese should have stopped us from invading Iraq?
I don't think it would have been a good idea for them to try. No, because we have nukes, they have nukes. I don't think that we would have dealt. I don't think we would have.
No, I think it would have been fine. I mean, really? Saddam Hussein was a genocidal bastard who deserved to probably hang for the things he did to the Kurdish community. But the problem is, it isn't a question about, is Saddam Hussein a good guy? It's a question about the future of Iraq and the future of the region and what's best and what's not best. And the occupation was a failure. The amount of death, now is Iraqi society better than it was under Saddam? Probably. But what was the death toll to get to that? Was it too high?
So you do think that like Russia or China should have intervened and basically?
I don't know if they should have like deployed troops, but if they could have tried to work with international bodies or anything to stop us outside of putting troops on the ground, probably, yeah. Yes, I do think the international community should have stopped the United States from invading Iraq. Yes.
But given the fact that the goons that were in power, Dick Cheney, George W. Bush, the Bush entire family, legacy CIA, the most heinous neoconservative, just destructive people that are, modern American history has known. You don't think that that would have increased the chance of us escalating to a nuclear war, reigniting the Cold War, turning it into a hot war? I mean, these were all of the reasons.
I mean, at a certain, probably not. No, I mean, if I'm being,
you don't think that?
I mean, we put guns on the back of Chinese donkeys with the Chinese government, right? So there's China, America, and Russia, and the Soviet Union, as they invaded Afghanistan. That was a 10-year-long war. They were providing the missiles that shot down Soviet helicopters, killed thousands and thousands upon their troops, and eventually led to the collapse of the Soviet Union, the largest nuclear power on the planet. We did that. The Soviet Union supported the Viet Cong. They supported the Viet Cong against American soldiers. They used Soviet equipment to shoot American GIs. No nuclear war started then. They supported the Cuban government, which was right on the shores of the United States, a communist government that America didn't like. It led to the Cuban Missile Crisis, which didn't end the world. The thing is, there have been a million conflicts like this, and I think a lot of people try to say that this conflict is particularly special in its nuclear element, or particularly it's much higher than the rest. I don't really find that to be the case. I think that's largely fear-mongering.
So you're not concerned about the possibility of nuclear war in this situation, even though Putin has explicitly put it on the table?
I mean, he's explicitly put it on the table, then explicitly taken it off the table, and explicitly put it back on the table, and explicitly took it back off the table. We have his ambassador to the UK saying there's no possibility of Russia using a nuke in Ukraine. Then next week they say, well, we'll use a nuke to defend Russia if its territorial integrity is threatened. Then we'll see Ukraine conduct a successful counteroffensive on territory that they say is now Russia, and then it's not used. And that it's just the position is so flimsy. I do think they probably have considered its use, but I think every single time they've considered it, they're probably going to come to the same conclusion that any sensible military strategist would, is that the benefits are not nearly as great as the negatives. They're not going to get much strategic benefit from it. It's mostly going to be used as a terror weapon. They're going to see massive sanctions, massive increase of support to Ukraine, both humanitarian, economic, and military. And this is the one scenario where you could actually get India and China to agree on a price cap on Russian energy exports. So
clearly Putin has not proven to be a sensible military leader. We can agree with that, right? I don't think his invasion of Ukraine has been terribly successful. I don't think it was a terribly wise idea in the first place from a geopolitical standpoint for Russia. So I don't think we can assume that he's coming to this from a sensible perspective. I think in many ways he's coming at it from a very emotional perspective.
I think Putin is more, I don't believe in the madman theory. I know a lot of people try to portray Putin as an insane madman. I think the reason he's held on to power for so long isn't because he's a madman. I think it's because he's a smart guy. He's a bad guy, but he's a smart guy. I think that he's going to weigh the costs and benefits of this. And the problem is also Putin, one of the main things about leadership and leading any country, especially when it's an authoritarian country, is you never give an order that will not be followed. If you start giving orders that won't be followed, then that's when your regime really starts to fall apart, because people see that your power is not ultimate. And if Putin was to give this order, this wouldn't be the first time historically there's been an order to fire and it would be denied. And I think this would have to go through him, then a general, then through another guy, then eventually to one of the soldiers who would actually have to get on the vehicle and deliver the nuclear munition. And if one single person along that chain of command says no, or there's some problem, then it just doesn't happen.
From what I've understand, Putin actually does not have that kind of chain of command, sort of checks and balances, that he can just launch a nuke if he so desires.
No, that's not.
Our own president doesn't have those kinds of checks and balances. Once every 5 years, there's an article that comes out, and it's evergreen material for every milquetoast newspaper, right? And they'll be like, oh, let's talk about the nuclear football, probably right in time for American football season, right? And they talk about how it's actually wild that there's a dude that walks around to this day with a handcuff on a briefcase. This is legitimate U.S. policy still. And he has a direct line to the president at all times if the man calls a nuclear strike.
What an insane job, by the way. Could you imagine, my job is to drag around every day what could destroy all of humanity?
Crazy. It's
an insane amount of influence.
But that just hold on, if you could just let me finish really quickly. That just illustrates the point that I'm making, that even here in a country that we're assuming is more sane than Putin in this scenario, right? That we're actually considering as the ally to the Ukrainian people in this situation. If we're talking about how we have like split decision, right? There's the other famous example, if we want to plot through history, of the one submariner who saved the world, right?
Yeah.
Because he, misread it, right? So we know how quick of a fuse it is, right? And you brought up two examples where, there was no nuke that was fired, but I can think of two examples where atomic bombs were dropped, and they were done brashly and to display their power to the Soviets and the Chinese government.
Yeah,
it was done by Harry Truman, a guy who came from,
1945
right
is
where we're
different
reporting
than
right now.
2022, though, because there's no other country in the world that could have nuked America back, because there was no other country in the world with nukes. So to compare nuclear policy in 1945 to 2022 is like comparing people fighting with sticks to people fighting with machine guns. Like, the tactics have changed, and like nuclear brinkmanship has changed massively. But I'm like, it is true that if Putin was to give the order to use nukes, it isn't just him, person who launches nuke. That's not the order of command. There's more people in between that. It's meant to still happen at a relatively fast pace, but if one person along the chain of command says no, and he would be defying orders, but if a single one of them was like, I don't want my family to die, I don't want
Couldn't
my
they just get
family
fired though? Wouldn't Putin just fire that person and replace them? Like, I don't think that some lowly general is going to stop Putin from doing what he wants.
They could try. I mean, they could try to do that, but let's be for real. Like, I think Putin is somewhat scared about the amount of control he has over his own government. I think he is somewhat scared about the amount of whether every single person would follow that order. And I think that everybody doesn't just serve Putin. Like, a lot of these people are oligarchs. They're very selfish people. They're people who look out for their own like profit benefit.
And how would the invasion have happened in the first place? Because like I said, that was not wise from a geopolitical or financial
it was not wise, but it was not national suicide. There's a difference between me aiming a gun at something, thinking I'm going to kill it, pulling the trigger, right? And it ricochets and hits me, and I'm like, oh, I couldn't have foreseen this consequence. And me putting a gun to my head and pulling the trigger. These are two different scenarios. The reason why a nuke has not been used, even in the hands of people much crazier than Putin, like the Kim regime, right? When we're talking about people who I would say are actively trying to say, look at me, I'm crazy, right? They're doing it right now as they launch missiles over Japan. The reason why is they understand the breaking of this taboo, what it would mean, and what it would mean for possibly the end of the world. And so I do think that the Russian government, just like our government, isn't trying to commit national suicide. I think a lot of this idea of like Russia on this path to victory or death kind of comes from this idea of like Russia and China. This is from communist times. They're like ant colony nations, you know? They're just kind of like, oh, however casualties take, it doesn't matter. But it kind of does, because if you kill like 60 to 70% of your nation in a global thermonuclear war, like, your nation is fucked. Your nation's destroyed. Russia will fall apart at the seams. There are people in Dagestan and Chechnya who are ready at the drop of the hat to say, we've seceded, goodbye. Like the Kadyrov lineage is only loyal to Putin because Putin offered him power. Like, they can switch on a dime if necessary. So I don't think that it's like, I don't think Russia is ready to commit national suicide over Zaporozhye, Kherson, Donetsk, or Luhansk. I don't think they are.
So you're just not worried about that. That's not part of your.
I think there's a risk. Of course, there's a risk anytime there's any conflict like this. But I believe that the risk would be greater if we reward said behavior with like, okay, you can do this. Because imagine if in Vietnam, as we were getting our ass kicked, right? You would say in Vietnam we got our ass kicked somewhat, right?
Absolutely.
Like, let's say during the last year, Nixon got on stage. He's like, hello, everyone. I'm going to nuke Vietnam if they don't secede to us. Like, if he did that, would you expect the Soviet Union to be like, okay, Viet Cong, you got to put down your guns? Or, okay, you know what? Maybe you need to... He didn't do that. I mean,
what I will say to that, Dylan, what I will say to that is...
worked.
Sure, and that's possibly true, but and as terrible as Vietnam was, I still don't think it would have been worth starting World War III over. In the same way that I don't think it would be worth starting World War III over this conflict.
If you were the leader of the Soviet Union and Nixon came out and he was like, "Oh boy, we're gonna get a little heated here," would you be like, "Viet Cong, I'm sorry, like it is what it is. You got to put down your arms"?
I mean, Putin's been threatening nuclear war for a while now. It's not like he just at the last minute said, hey, I'm going to nuke people. Like, this has been part of his, rhetoric for a long time now. And I do think we should take it seriously when, as you acknowledge, we're talking about...
seriously, but we don't cave to it as if we believe Russia is a suicidal state.
I mean, they've kind of proven to be a unreasonable, borderline suicidal, at least economically, state with their invasion of Ukraine in the first place. No one predicted that they would do that. No one was, saying that would be a good idea for their interests geopolitically. I just don't think we can,
I mean, it was a bad idea for America to invade Vietnam, but the world didn't end. It was a bad idea for the Soviet Union to invade Afghanistan, and the idea that the Soviet Union would act as a rational actor, to many people might seem silly, but at the end of the day, they chose the collapse of the Soviet Union before using a nuclear weapon in Afghanistan to try to submit the Afghan people. And it's largely because it also probably wouldn't work, which I think Putin also knows that it probably wouldn't work in Ukraine as well. Do you think the Ukrainian people would submit themselves
all the people with power during the collapse of the Soviet Union? Here, this is an interesting tidbit of history for the audience. You probably already know this, Dylan. But during the Yeltsin era, what they did was, what American capital did was they were like, yes, destroy all of break up the Soviet Union, right? Except we are going to create a bunch of oligarchs, right? And we're going to chop up what's left of Russian finance, and we're going to bestow it to oligarchs, and it will be very much kind of how the United States emerged in the 90s as well, right? That's how they bought everybody off. When they hyper recapitalized Russia, they made all of the people that were in charge either destitute or rich as fuck. That was how they averted nuclear.
And you know what? If you're one of those oligarchs, you don't want to die. You don't want all your belongings to go up a nuclear hellfire. You don't want the world to end so all this money you've hoarded for your kids or so you can build a giant penis statue. I don't know what these people do in their private lives, okay? Whatever it is, it's gone once the world goes kabooey. And I feel like a lot of this, and I'm not saying you guys are doing this, I feel like a lot of this is almost like Cold War era, like they don't care about human life. They don't care about human life at all. They just care about Marx and communism. They're an ant colony nation. Like I don't think that these leaders are like that irrational. I do think Putin is to some extent a rational actor, and if he's not, the people around him are self-interested enough to try to stop something like that from happening.
I just completely disagree with that. I mean,
what would be the benefit of using the nuclear weapon?
Who got elected were rational actors. Like, I sure as shit wouldn't call Donald Trump a rational actor. I would not call George Bush a rational actor.
Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin are different
and you would
people.
say, well, at least they have all these people around them, right? All these smart guys, except in the case of fucking Donald Trump, that was like Mike Pompeo and John Bolton. Those were the smart guys around him. Those were the rational actors. So I can only imagine. It's like, I don't kick it in the Kremlin. I don't know who Putin has as his inner circle, but I can only imagine they're a bunch of fucking yes men because he's been in power so long he would have whacked them if they weren't.
The thing is, I think Putin's rise to power and his actions in politics shows him not to be a buffoon like Donald Trump. Or I think Donald Trump is more buffoony than Bush, which is a high bar, but I would also say the same thing about Bush. I think he got to politics in a different way than these people. These are people, both Bush and Donald Trump, who got into power largely based off of their familial history, largely based on the fact that Bush's father was a president and he was influential and he was able to ride that coattails into the public consciousness to become president. Donald Trump inherited a lot of money from his father, was able to at least maintain that money, be a reality TV star, and basically, I don't want to say meme his way into the White House, but the path he chose was very untraditional. Where if you look at Putin's political career, the type of backroom, being quiet, maneuvering, making sure you don't get ousted, becoming the mayor, and slowly climbing his way up until like he just got the opportunity from Yeltsin that nobody thought he was going to get. People thought he was going to be out of office in a year, and then he's able to maneuver his way into 20 years of power and through multiple military interventions in Chechnya and in Ukraine before, and in Syria. And so I don't think he's done all this work as a buffoon, or he's done all this work without some understanding of nuclear doctrine, considering its nuclear doctrine is such a big part of Russia's, foreign policy and even part of their constitution. And so I don't think Putin is anything like Donald Trump or George Bush. I do think he's to some extent a rational actor, but even rational actors sometimes make irrational choices like the invasion of Ukraine, because even the United States thought Ukraine was going to collapse. Everyone thought Ukraine was going to collapse. I know you guys probably thought it. I thought it. Everyone thought Ukraine was going to collapse in a few days. But the amount of corruption in the Russian military, their arrogance really was their undoing. And so ever since then, Putin is trying to scrape something out of this war. But he cannot win this war through the use of a nuclear device. that would not see him winning this war whatsoever. There's no outcome where he uses a nuclear weapon and then he wins the war. It's not going to be a strategic weapon that changes the face of the battlefield. It would be nothing more than a weapon of terror that would prompt so much backlash, both in aid, military, and everything. The negatives outweigh the benefits. I just don't think he's going to do it.
Okay.
And America hasn't changed its nuclear stance, its nuclear posture in response to it, because we still think the odds of something like this happening are very, very low.
All right. Well, let's agree to disagree there. I think we're a little bit more concerned about the possibility of nuclear war than you, but let's put that aside for now. Would you support U.S. boots on the ground in Ukraine given the current state of the crisis?
No, nothing like outside of like some CIA ops, probably not. No.
Why not?
Because I do think there is a difference between American soldiers directly combating Russian soldiers and us fighting through somebody else. Or
what's the difference?
The difference is it allows us to keep this idea of nuclear states don't fight person to person directly. It's something that preserves the nuclear taboo.
So you think that if we did put boots on the ground, then we would be looking at the possibility of nuclear war? That would enter your equation?
I think the only scenario where we should do something like that is if somehow the Russians make the insane calculation that somehow they're going to win the war through the use of nuclear weapon, and a conventional strike on whatever delivered the nuclear weapon, I think would be like, I think almost like the bare minimum the United States would have to do in a situation like that.
So you do understand the concept of why it would be dangerous to escalate with another nuclear armed superpower?
Of course, there's danger in escalating, but there's also, I would say, more danger in not responding. And the reason why is that if we tell all international actors, whether it be Ethiopia, whether it be Sudan, whether it be Pakistan or India or, God forbid, North Korea, that you can invade a country, make nuclear threats, and then the world's just fucked, all that's going to do is encourage more nuclear threats like this down the line, or possibly that this is actually something that we're willing to allow. We're willing to allow this taboo to be broken. We can't allow people to kind of just like hold over the end of humanity over everybody and say, well, we're just going to have to give you everything you want then.
Correct. So, sorry. What would you think is a good end goal for America's foreign policy, or at least our policy as it relates to aiding and funding this conflict? How long do you think this should go on? Well, how long do you think we should continue to fund the crisis? I mean, because our war in Afghanistan, for example, lasted over a decade. Like, do you think we should just keep funding this war, expending more and more taxpayer money on more and more lethal aid packages for the next 5-10 years?
The first goal they need to replace my grandfather, Mr. Burns, in the CIA with me. Okay, so that's the first thing that we need to do to end this conflict. The second thing is I think we should supply them until Russia leaves. Yes.
So basically, just like blank check until it's over.
Basically, until I would say the situation has shown itself to be unmovable, or like all like routes towards victory have been like properly, I would say, exhausted, then that's when you get to the negotiating table. Or if the Ukrainians have decided, this independent struggle, we care about it a lot, but the suffering is too great, which I think would be one of the main things to make us,
and
okay,
you're not
we can't support them anymore.
All concerned with the impact that this has in further enriching and further entrenching, what we all charitably refer to as the military industrial complex, and the fact that you're not concerned about. Okay.
No, because if let's say that I said I was going to send weapons to Ukraine, but then I heard that a mean guy was going to make $1 off of it, right? I feel like, to me, that almost feels like spite-based politics, because every single war since the beginning of humanity, since humans have started sharpening rocks to beat the shit out of another human because he didn't like their Unga Bunga tune in year 2, right? Ever since human beings have started sharpening rocks to kill other human beings, people have made money off of it. This is true with swords, spikes, spears, all the way to machine guns and tanks and planes. But that doesn't mean that every single time there's a righteous war because somebody's gonna, with bad intentions, or they're profitable and greedy, right? Because they want to make a buck off of it. I'm going to say, no, because I don't like that guy, I'm not going to fight this righteous struggle because that guy might make $1. I mean,
right. No, we understand.
Yeah?
I understand what you're saying, Dylan, and I agree to a certain extent. But I think the point that Zach is making, and the point that I also would make in this situation, is that it's not so much like, oh, it just happens to be enriching this person. It's at what point do our strategic decisions become at the behest of those profitable interests? At what point do our strategic moves in a conflict like this with another nuclear armed superpower, which could escalate to something far greater? Yeah,
That's a difficult question.
And I don't want. Well, here, let me finish. I don't want profit-based company calling the shots of our foreign policy because they want to enrich themselves, because they want to increase their bottom line. And you can say, well, it just happens to be in the best interests of these people that need help. That's fair. But again, that's legitimizing our status as the world police. And also that legitimizes their interests and their ability to call the shots going forward as well in other conflicts too. I don't trust them to do that. Within the last 10, 20 years, we've seen a myriad of reasons not to trust that and give them the reins of power over our weapons and over our military strategy.
Whether or not we support Ukraine is not going to decide whether the military-industrial complex stays or goes. The weapons we're sending to Ukraine, if we don't send them to Ukraine, they're going to go to Egypt, they're going to go to Israel, they're going to go to Saudi Arabia, and then they're going to be used on Yemeni
That's
children.
simply not true.
Well, a lot of them would be. A lot of them, I think, would be.
You think we'd be sending $80 billion in weapons to other countries if it weren't for Ukraine?
I do think that eventually these weapons would be sent somewhere, or they would rot for the rest of their existence in some storage unit, like a lot of our Abrams tanks are, not being used, which are both wasteful. We take these weapons and put them towards a good cause, or we let them sit there and do nothing, or we send them to the Saudis. Like, this is like the only like routes we have for these.
Well, I'm not
weapons,
in favor of sending them to the Saudis either. I'm not in favor of.
So we just keep them in like a storage, because we're not going to like take apart all these weapons and like give them back to America in a tax
Gotta
refund.
stop making them. That's my first suggestion.
Well, we already have them. The weapons we're sending them, we already have. These javelins were in storage units.
And as soon as we send them, they'll say, "See, we just lost all these weapons. We have to make some more of them." This is how it
towards a good
through,
cause. The problem is this exists in every country.
Good cause, Dylan, spending $40 billion giving Americans fucking health insurance when they don't have it.
We can do both. We can chew gum and walk at the same time. I don't think that the amount of we are the wealthiest nation God has ever created, the United States. The idea that the problem is we just don't have enough money to go around, I find it a little silly. I find it a little silly. And I do think that the American public consciousness over this war is a lot different than, say, the war in Somalia or the war in Yemen, because the vast majority of Americans see that this is a righteous cause, and you guys don't even disagree with the idea that this is a righteous cause. And so if we can have an institution you don't even particularly do a good thing while it exists, why am I going to stop them from doing a good thing? You can say this is going to empower them more, but the thing is, they would find another war. You think that if we didn't support Ukraine, that the military and industrial complex is going to collapse? We should support Ukraine whether the military industrial complex exists or doesn't exist, because it's a righteous cause.
But do you not worry at all about the fact that maybe our strategy is being guided by the profit motives and the fact that the military industrial complex, all of these defense contractors, which historically, literally within modern American history, have been calling the shots, you don't worry about them?
That is difficult to say, because the problem is,
I don't think it's difficult to say, given the fact that if you look at recent American history. What do you think we're living in?
It's difficult to say.
Pacifist nation?
No, I don't think we're living in a pacifist nation. I think it's difficult to read a people's intentions or everybody's involved intentions or motives. Like I said before, I think every war, the reasons people go to war are totally different depending on the person. If you ask a lobbyist for a military industrial complex why was he supporting Ukraine, he might have some like personal reasons to support Ukraine, but obviously the main motivator for him could be the military industrial complex. Duh. But if you ask the Ukrainian lobby in the United States why they're lobbying politicians to support Ukraine, or if you ask all the people protesting outside of politicians' offices saying, if you don't support Ukraine, if you don't send them aid, we're not going to re-elect you, we're not going to support you, we're not going to endorse you. Like, I think the motivations for America are multifaceted, and whether or not one of those motivations from one of the factors that decides of whether we go to war or not have bad intentions when it comes to what they want to get out of this war, if it's a good cause, I'm willing to work with a multitude of tools and institutions in order to accomplish good cause. A great example of this is, let's say that I'm talking to somebody who's a libertarian who wants to end the drug war, but he wants to end the drug war for reasons that I don't think are good. Let's say he's like, I only care about the money I want to make on my marijuana farm. That doesn't concern me. What's important to me is ending the drug war.
Right, but would you not agree that basically every intervention and every war that we've involved ourselves in or sponsored over the last, in modern American history, those have all been also done under the guise of humanitarianism? You could say, well, I don't support U.S. intervention.
Yeah,
I don't
some
want
of them were righteous and some of them weren't.
Can you let me finish? I'm saying, go back to Iraq. We got to liberate the Iraqis. If it just so happens to align with enriching the military-industrial complex, furthering our geopolitical interests in the region, yada, 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 that, we can overlook all of that because we really want the Iraqis to be liberated. And we really need to take care of this bad guy, Saddam Hussein, who's doing these horrible things. You want to sit idly by and let him commit these atrocities? What is this? This just happens to align with the moral position. Let's do it. I mean, that's basically the logic you're employing here.
So do you think that the Ukrainian struggle is not the correct one? Because for me, this would only be a concern.
Do you think Saddam Hussein is a good guy and should be allowed to
No, but I
consider...
don't think the Iraq war was a moral struggle. I do think the Ukrainian independence struggle is a moral struggle. I think Operation Provide Comfort to the Kurdistan region in northern Iraq was absolutely immoral. I don't think the invasion of Iraq was moral. I can have nuance when it comes to these things. Like, I can think one thing is immoral and support
But you know who doesn't have nuance when it comes to these things? The military-industrial complex, the defense contractors,
which is why I'm not
calling the
saying
shots.
I'm not saying give them all the power. I'm saying this is a righteous struggle, which you seem to agree with. Whether they like it or not should not determine, like, well, I was going to support Ukraine, but I heard that guy also supports Ukraine. Then
I can acknowledge it's a righteous struggle, but I can also acknowledge that there's 100 or more humanitarian crises unfolding across the globe right now, most of which we're sponsoring, most of which we're facilitating and enabling. So yeah, you can find one and say this is a noble cause. That doesn't mean we should give the military-industrial complex and the defense contractors carte blanche to do whatever they want and ship away billions and billions of dollars.
I never said we should give them carte blanche.
You said we should give them a blank check until the conflict
I said we should,
resolved.
yes, we should send the Ukrainian people weapons. I didn't say we allow the military-industrial complex to do whatever it wants. A lot of the weapons they want to send to Ukraine are not weapons that Ukraine needs. A lot of the things they want to sell are reserves of stuff that are just not going to be good for the Ukrainian landscape, right? So I'm not saying just, oh, let's just give them endless amounts of money and throw whatever we can at Ukraine. We should give Ukraine what it needs to stay an independent, sovereign nation state. And whether or not some bad people like that or not is not going to influence whether or not I support Ukraine.
Well, what if they say they need boots on the ground?
Then I'll disagree with them.
That's what I'm doing now. I'm disagreeing with what you think they think is necessary in this conflict because I don't trust our.
I don't need to trust somebody in order to use the tools in the tool belt towards a righteous struggle. Like, for example, do you think the Soviet Union trusted the United States? No. But they accepted our aid when they were fighting the Nazis. They accepted our cans of goods. They accepted our trucks. They accepted all the aid we sent them. Same thing is true of many other powers during that war. Do you think the Soviet Union or the international community should have said, stop? I think there might be an ulterior motive here. Maybe America doesn't care about fascism. Maybe they just care about keeping the Atlantist power and what. At that point, I'm going to.
That's true because in the 30s we were massively in support of the German interest and the Italian, when we, along with guys like Winston Churchill, thought that they needed strong leaders in order to bring their country back from the destruction we brought.
So we shouldn't have supported the Soviet Union. Would be the conclusion. Is you do not trust these people who have showed themselves to be dishonest, that have showed themselves to be bad actors. But the Soviet Union was not going to be very picky when it came to their struggle of survival against Nazi fascism. And I think the United States should have supported them, even if the Soviet Union didn't trust us. And I didn't trust the Soviet Union when it came to what Europe was going to look like afterwards, as we could see from the conditions in East Germany or what they did through much of the Soviet Union to independence struggles in Hungary or in other locations. Like, the Soviet Union did a lot of bad things after the war. But the thing is, the beating the Nazis was the priority. The priority here is getting the Russians out of Ukraine.
Gotcha. Well, I do want to ask you one more question, Dylan. We've been going on for almost an hour here, and it's definitely been a lively conversation. One more thing I wanted to ask you about as it relates to this conflict is you might have been paying attention recently in a letter from the Congressional Progressive Caucus, which was subsequently rescinded basically the next day. 30 Democrats called on Joe Biden to pair the unprecedented economic and military support that the U.S. is providing Ukraine with a diplomatic push, redoubling efforts to seek a realistic framework for a ceasefire. So again, these are 30 Democrat politicians. Unfortunately, in my opinion, they withdrew the letter. I think they got kind of cold feet. They saw the backlash online from some various activists and decided to rescind the letter, which again I just find to be totally cowardly. But put that aside, do you agree with that notion that at very least, if you think that we should be continuing to fund this conflict to the tune that we are, at very least, do you agree that we should be playing a diplomatic role in trying to resolve the conflict, trying to get these two parties to the table and work something out, because it's honestly in the best interest of everyone, including them?
I would say first, I don't think we should continue to send them the weapons. We should expand it. I think we should send longer range missiles. I think we're not sending them enough. I just wanted to clarify that. But when it comes to this, it's really weird with this letter because they pulled the card that they always pull when something like this happens. Oh, it was the staffers, the poor unguided masses, the dredges of the halls of Congress. The staffers did it, not us. I have no clue whether it was actually a staffer's mistake or if they all got cold feet or exactly what happened. But I think the biggest takeaway I honestly have from this is it just made the Progressive Caucus look unorganized, unprofessional, and like they didn't know what they were doing. It made them look like they were flip-flopping and they didn't have a concrete position. If they were going to withdraw this letter, they shouldn't have released it. If the problem is the fact that they didn't check this with all the people who signed it for like revisions or whatever, like then they should have done that. They just ended up coming off extremely unorganized. And the problem is with progressives in this country is that has always been the biggest criticism that thrown at progressives, that they don't know what they're doing, they don't have experience, and they look unorganized. And this is going to kind of like reaffirm that belief in the minds of many Americans. That's the first conclusion I would have. Secondly to that, I don't have too much problem with the letter. I do think more clarification should have been around the word ceasefire. Like just a bland call for ceasefire in this war particularly means nothing, considering ceasefires have been violated on so many different occasions, and the Russians have shown themselves to use ceasefires to try to get themselves in a better strategic position, which would particularly be true if it was to happen right now, considering their logistics around Kherson and a lot of other locations are so fucked, and they could use this to repair bridges that are right now straining Russian logistics, and their mobilization's going so terrible. So there's just so many factors that would motivate the Ukrainians not to agree to a ceasefire under current conditions, unless it was almost certain that a war would end from it because of Russia's historical usage of ceasefires to get into a better strategic position, that I think there should have been more clarification around the idea that negotiate a ceasefire knowing that the ceasefire is like more guaranteed to have success, or knowing but negotiating a ceasefire while knowing that the actors we're negotiating with could use a reckless ceasefire, or a ceasefire without like consideration, could use it to just extend the conflict or try to get into a better like position.
Sure.
So I think like I'm not against a call for diplomacy, but I'm for diplomacy generally. But I think when what's
oh nothing nothing.
Okay, I'm for diplomacy generally, and so I guess my one thing is when people are asking for diplomacy is just to consider what the Russian position is currently, which is just insane. The Russian position is that as like to get into negotiations, for us to negotiate with them, we have to accept Crimea, Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporozhye as Russian territory. Like that is a wild starting position for a negotiation, and to say that's that's the preconditions. That is a ridiculous position. And so if Russia is going to go enter negotiations, they need to do it with a real willingness to try to end the conflict that would actually be beneficial for the future of Ukraine, understanding Ukrainian sovereignty, and not just disregarding the fact that the people of Kherson very obviously don't want to be occupied. You can see it from the amount of resistance that's going on, or from any polling data that exists, because there's no polling data that exists that says the people of Kherson want to be part of Russia. That's also true for Zaporozhye, Donetsk, and Luhansk. So for them to say that as a precondition, this territory is just ours and you have to have it, it's ridiculous. And so when you enter negotiations, you can only enter negotiations once the other party is like in touch with reality.
Yeah, well, I think that's a good place for us to kind of clarify on, because I think that that's the best starting position, not the Russian demands, but the fact that we're both on board for diplomacy and establishing some sort of peaceful relationship, and at least doing some diligent role as a world superpower and as a player in this game, as you mentioned, to at least do everything that we can to help Ukraine negotiate diplomatically. Because, like, obviously, Gavin and I don't want individuals to be under authoritarian rule, or be taken over by Russia if they don't want to. That's absurd. Nobody should be asked to fucking just oh, here you go, like, here's the boo, kiss it. Like, I'm not trying to make that position at all, but I do think that it just looked bad, and I think you agreed to it, that the Progressive Caucus would come out and say, like, yeah, we're pro peace and diplomacy, and then be like, whoa, wait, no, we don't actually support peace and diplomacy. It's like, okay, let's get down and iron out some semantics, but running scared from diplomacy is not necessarily a good look from the left.
Remember when Trump negotiated with Kim Jong-un, and like everybody was like, wow, this is the start of a major sea change in U.S. policy, and like nothing ever happened from it. The reason nothing ever happened from those negotiations is because Donald Trump said, okay, we're going to stop these military drills. We're going to stop them in order to enter negotiations. And now we enter negotiations. Okay. And so they gave, right off the bat, they gave North Korea something. They enter negotiations, and Trump looks at them and he says, okay, here's the deal. You give us all of your nukes and you get like McDonald's. You get all the economic. It's like, this is not a serious proposal. This is not like, this wasn't like, we're going to slowly fade in and we'll take 5 nukes with a relief of 5% of the sanctions. And like, we're slowly going to, that wasn't what happened. It was, but in part because the North Korean position was still, I think, not in touch with reality, with the idea that nobody's going to accept a nuclear armed North Korea ever back into the world stage, probably while they still have nukes, right? The Chinese probably aren't very happy about the idea that most world leaders, most world nations are not happy with them and how they've used their nuclear arsenal, for example, to threaten Japan with nuclear tests over them. And the American position was not attached to reality because we weren't willing to offer up enough to reach that reality, right? And so because nobody was in touch with reality, there was never going to be any success. And both of the actors were not in touch with reality. And so until Russia has a position that is in touch with what Ukrainians want and is in touch with what the situation really is on the ground, because they're not really winning. They're not going to take Kiev. The idea of them taking Kiev is just not on the table anymore. Them taking Mykolaiv isn't on the table. Them taking Odessa isn't on the table. And so they need to kind of almost take like an ice bucket challenge, like clear their head, do whatever they need to do, and figure out that, like, look, they fucked up. They put a lot of the cards on the table, took a massive L, and they probably just need to leave.
Yeah, I mean, I wish they would, man. Obviously, you're not going to find any disagreement from us there. I think the only disagreements we have is, the best way to obtain that, and hopefully we don't endanger the rest of the world in the process of obtaining that goal. So I think we just have slightly different opinions on the, for example, risk of nuclear war and what that might mean for the rest of the global community if this conflict spiraled into such an event. But either way, we really enjoyed chatting with you, man. It was a good conversation. Definitely got a little bit spirited, but we appreciate you bringing your perspective to our audience today. And yeah, thanks for taking the time.
Okay, awesome. You guys have a good one, and stay safe, okay?
Yeah, you take care, man.